I think the greatest challenge right now is dealing with the progressive phase of this disease. I think over the last 2 decades, we've been able to come up with fairly good medications to control attacks and relapses, but we're still not able to really slow the progression the way we believe we need to be. And at this conference this whole week has been all about the progressive phase of MS. And we're learning more and more about what some of the pathology and the pathophysiology is of progressive MS. I don't believe we're there yet. And we clearly don't have markers for a good way to test a drug or a therapy in a short enough time frame to be able to make an impact in this disease. So I think one of the greatest challenges is both from the standpoint of understanding the progressive disease phase of MS, as well as can we come up with agents to repair any damage that has occurred to give people recovery from an attack. I think it's a pretty big step in terms of another compound available to treat MS. The data from the relapsing remitting trials looked at an active comparator, and that study looks very robust in terms of its effect. So here's another compound that you've got, ocrelizumab, that will end up being another option to go to. Safety signals from that trial did not show up to be any major issue, which is wonderful. And then they've done the primary progressive trial. And the primary progressive trial also showed some slowing of progression, not as robustly as we would have hoped, but at least it was statistically significant. And we think that at least it's a first step into the conversation of treatments for primary progressive MS. I think it points to the way the drug works and its mechanism, and to be able to show a difference there, I think is important because, we think of progressive phase of MS as being really not inflammatory. And this is another drug that has an anti-inflammatory effect. So maybe the modest effect that we see is because as the disease progresses, there's less inflammation, and then you're not able to necessarily attack it the same way you do in the large inflammatory activity in relapsing remitting MS. But I think overall, there's probably some chronic low-grade inflammation that is still present there, and that's probably where this drug is working, that we can see this benefit. But to get to the bigger issue of progressive disease and finding agents that slow that phase when there's no evidence for inflammation, in the people who maybe don't get a benefit from this drug, how do we deal with those people? That's still a huge issue for us. Yes. Yeah. In my practice, I would say that if I have any patient who comes in with primary progressive MS, this is an option. And up until this point, we've had no data to drive the conversation of a benefit with the drug. So we've been putting them on some of the available drugs that we currently have, and we see how they do. We see what the side effect profile is. Is it of benefit to them? How much of an inconvenience is it to them to take this medication? But I think overall, we're not seeing any robust effects from those drugs. With this drug, I don't know that we'll see a robust effect, but if we stabilize them and we slow the rate of progression, and we have data at least to support that idea, and if you look at some of the data that got presented, looked at subgrouping out the primary progressive patients, maybe looking at people who had MRI activity, GAD-enhancing lesions on their MRI scan. They had a little bit more of a robust effect than the people who didn't. They all had a benefit, but you saw a little bit more of an effect in that population. And I just saw somebody last week who has a primary progressive diagnosis, a young person, maybe in their 30s, and they ended up having GAD-enhancing lesions on their scan. So here's somebody who fits the clinical criteria for primary progressive MS and would be somebody I would have enrolled in this clinical trial. I can at least let them know they would be probably a pretty good responder to this medication.